Now, today's session, the last session, is titled Countdown to the Procurement Team of 2030. And I'm going to be joined on stage here in just a moment by James Meads. James is the founder of ProcurementSoftware.site and the host of the Procuretech Podcast, and also a really good friend to us all here at Art of Procurement. So with that said, let me bring James on stage. And hey, James, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Phil. Good afternoon. Great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
No, it's a pleasure. I'm really looking forward to this last session. We're going to talk a little bit about when we talk 2030, you think 2030, that's a long way away. Well, it's 6 years away, which is kind of scary. So we're going to be talking about, what that path looks like, how we can be thinking about utilizing technology as procurement just continues, obviously on the path to digitization. Now, as we start, for those of you, for those in the audience who don't know you, I'm actually going to start by asking the typical Art of Procurement question, which is, did you find procurement or did procurement find you?
Procurement found me, but very indirectly. I got into procurement just before my final year at university. I did a summer job in an automotive gearbox manufacturer supplier in my hometown. And I was doing, this was the late 90s, I was doing purchasing clerk, purchase admin type of stuff. And yeah, I'd never really considered buying or procurement, like most of us didn't really know what it was. And that sort of gave me a little bit of an inside view. And it was just a lot easier to get job interviews for procurement roles than it was for things like sales and marketing or finance or any other graduate type job. So that's really what sort of whet my appetite. It wasn't until about 3 years later that I actually then joined Jaguar Land Rover in the UK on their graduate training program. So yeah, that's how I got in, but it was never, nobody grows up wanting to be a buyer, do they? So it was kind of a little bit random how I discovered it.
I think the automotive business does that to you as well, though. That was where my start was. And, I wonder if I'd have started in a different industry, whether I'd had the passion that I ended up having for procurement. But, automotive is both very stressful, but also I think very rewarding at the same time.
Yeah, it's a quick learning curve, isn't it? You get thrown in at the deep end.
Yeah, and you get told in no uncertain circumstances if you get things wrong as well. Now let's move on to kind of procurement technology. So why, as you kind of went through your procurement career, did that you then select procurement software as the focus of where you wanted to really look at from a career perspective, and then that has gone into your thought leadership and the content creation efforts that you have?
Yeah, it's the story goes that I quit my corporate job at the end of 2018, and initially the plan was to go into freelance consulting, working as an interim manager along that path. And as was very much the case now, but maybe a bit less so back then, I was looking at, okay, how do I build a bit of an audience, a bit of a personal brand, so as I can differentiate myself from people that are maybe a little bit more experienced in doing freelance work to be able to get these interim freelance gigs. And what I looked at was, I'd just been to one of these entrepreneurship conferences in London, and one of the presenters there had built a business of doing a podcast all about Disney. And you live in Orlando, you're familiar with Disney. You might even know this guy, actually. But he was a former lawyer from New Jersey, and he built his business through a Disney podcast. And I thought, so Philip Eidson's got Art of Procurement, so he's already nailed that market. And Matthias Gutzman had just done his first DPW. This was like late 2019. So I thought, well, what else is out there? I don't want to take on an established business, because why would you want to do that? So procurement technology was something that I was always curious about. One of the push factors that made me quit corporate was I spent, along with a lot of procurement people, about probably between a third and a half of my time doing non-value added tasks that could either be automated or given to a good admin assistant, truth be told. So like most procurement people, I've heard of Cooper and Ariba and a few of the other big players, Sievo at the time, who've always been pretty good at marketing. But I'd not really heard of any beyond that. And once I started to scratch the surface, I just realized what a really rich ecosystem there was there And there was pretty much something for everyone. And bearing in mind this was 2019, and fast forward 5 years to where we are now, and it's even more the case. So that was really what triggered me to do a podcast on procurement tech. And really it just grew from there. Once I started to get a bit of traction on the podcast, I thought there's got to be some sort of business model here to really democratize access to be able to search and filter on the length and breadth of the market of solutions that are out there. Initially, the idea was to put out something like a yearbook, and then as time went on, I just thought it would be better to build something that was a searchable web directory of these different tech platforms. So one of the problems, I'm guilty of doing this as well. I just put out a tech map yesterday for procurement tech for SMEs, or SMBs as you call them in the States. But I find them very, very two-dimensional, and it's very difficult nowadays to pigeonhole procurement technology into one specific bracket, because a lot of solutions do more than one thing. But there are still ones that are very much focused on one area, things like SaaS procurement or logistics procurement or e-sourcing. But many of them, especially some of the ones that are suite or module based, do a lot of different things. And the beauty of having a website and backend database that we sell as a product that goes into more detail is that you can search and filter on multiple criteria depending on what you're looking for. And I think that's really how we differentiate ourselves from what else is out there without having to go and spend a lot of money on a research subscription.
Yeah, well, the explosion in the market as well. You could never imagine the logos in the logo chart that we have today versus even 5 years ago. And that obviously takes a lot of sorting out and understanding what are the real areas of specialty, and also which segments of the market are each one of those procurement tech companies focused on, which is what the tool does. Now, when we think about from a corporate perspective, here we are in 2024. You work with a lot of companies in terms of helping them build their digital procurement roadmaps. How mature are the digital strategies of most procurement organizations that you come into contact with at the moment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, I tend to play more in the lower end of the market, because typically a large enterprise is going to go to an Accenture or a Deloitte or one of the big boys. But what I would generally see, and this is very helicopter view, I'd say that most large corporations, Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 businesses, have done some sort of digital transformation. Now, they may have done it badly. They may have implemented one of these big legacy suites and not really managed the change management particularly well, and then gone, okay, that's done next. But they've done something. What I find if I go towards the mid-market, or even towards rapidly scaling tech firms, tech unicorns, they are very much greenfield. And you tend to have two camps. You've got the very rapidly scaling tech or service-based businesses that have done absolutely nothing simply because they've grown so quickly. Startups are usually at Series C in most cases before they even hire a procurement person. For anyone that doesn't know what Series C is, that's typically going to be, a company's going to typically be probably around 500-ish employees at Series C, depending on what industry they're in. So, they're pretty decent sized business.
A lot of money.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Product and service at that point.
Yeah, so you've got that on the one hand, which is completely greenfield, or on the other hand, you've got your more old school, let's say traditional manufacturing businesses, and their challenge is you're going to have a lot of legacy tech. You're probably going to have 15, 20-year-old ERP system. Maybe if you're lucky, you're running an older version of something like SAP or Oracle, but a lot of them don't have that. They've just got some old finance payment on-premise system in place. And you've also got a lot of resistance to change in those organizations. You've typically got your people in accounts or in logistics that have been doing the same role for 10, 15 years in a lot of cases. So those are the two very distinct buckets that I would put them in, and you've got very different challenges and very different opportunities in either of those sectors, depending on which one you want to look at.
And so for those where it's a little bit of a greenfield, where do you start? Is there a typical, you're going to get your biggest bang for your buck by going and buying this segment of, or should I say, addressing this opportunity, and then you do that, and then you move on to the next one, and you move on to the next one? Is there a pretty, or do you see at the smaller enterprises, the medium-sized companies, that there's a typical path that you take when you're investing in procurement tech?
Yeah, so if I get an inbound inquiry or someone that just wants to reach out and pick my brain, it usually comes off of two distinct things that they're looking for. They're either looking for procure-to-pay, source-to-pay software, or increasingly they're looking for something around contract management, supplier onboarding, vendor relationship management in some form. I would say, and this is just my personal opinion, I genuinely believe there's no right or wrong answer, because going back to what you preach about, we have to listen to business in terms of what they want and what they're pushing for. My philosophy on this would be, before you do any of that, you need to know what you're spending your money on. So I personally would look at spend analytics software. Now, if you're below 50, maybe $100 million, pounds, euro in revenue, you can probably do a pretty decent job on spend analytics in Excel. Yeah. If you're above that, then it kind of gets more complex, especially if you're pulling in multiple different ERP systems where the data doesn't speak to each other. It's not as expensive as you think it is. I mean, yes, you're not going to go out and buy a spend analytics tool for $5,000, but you're also not going to have to spend $100,000 on it either. There are plenty of effective spend analytics tools that are out there that support growing businesses or the mid-market, where you don't have to go out and buy an enterprise level spend analytics platform. So that would be what I would personally do first. And then in most of these businesses, I mean, especially if I look at the more traditional business, the typical challenge that they face is that they've got a CPO or a head of procurement that's maybe come down from corporate to take a head of role, and they've usually got a team of buyers and maybe a couple of category managers, and because they can't pay the salaries and they don't have brand equity to attract the best people, inevitably they're not going to have a team of A players. So that person's typical challenge in that role is going to be, okay, well, how can I free up my people from doing day-to-day grunt work and firefighting, and hopefully, if they're good at what they do, to be able to coach them into thinking a little bit more strategically. So for me, then, some sort of source-to-pay or procure-to-pay platform would be next on the list. And again, for somewhere between 25 and 50K, depending on what features you want it to have, you can get very, very good platform that you can implement in 2 to 3 months rather than a year. These aren't plug-and-play type of platforms, unfortunately, because they do have to integrate with your payment system. So they are a little bit more difficult to implement than, say, contract management or resourcing platforms. But again, it's not prohibitively expensive, as long as you've got that in your budget and you've had a sensible conversation with your CFO around how much you need to spend, and that it's an investment rather than a cost. And you will see the ROI in terms of the bandwidth that frees up within your team to be able to go and spend it on things that we should be doing, like category management, speaking to stakeholders, having more engaging conversations with our supply base.
Yeah, I think it's something that I think is important that you said, that sometimes gets missed when small or medium-sized organizations are thinking about the tech roadmap, is that for some of those standalone solutions, you can grow into different more complex or more powerful tools and technology, but you don't need to start there on day one. So what I mean by that is, as you see when you put together the software site database and the tech maps that you put together, there are some where you can go and get spend analytics for a lower cost on day one, just so you have some idea of spend analytics. Is it going to do all the things that you might need in 12, 24, 36 months? Maybe it's not, but it's going to get you on the journey where you can then demonstrate the ROI from that investment and then kind of grow up and step up into different solutions, as opposed to necessarily going for the more expensive, more powerful one on day one.
Yeah, and I think spend analytics, you probably can get get it to do most of what you want it to without spending a fortune. If you're looking at contract management or source to pay, then that is somewhere where you might have to put something a little bit more.
Right, it depends on how much you actually have to integrate it. You don't want to spend something. You don't want to spend money and time on integrating something on buying something that integrates into everything and then swapping that out in 12 months. But when you have stuff that can stand alone, it's a lot easier to do that.
Yeah, 100%. It's also spend analytics being a great example. How many people need access to it? If it's a spend analytics platform, then only procurement and maybe finance will need to use it. Whereas if you're implementing something like Procure to Pay or a contract management platform, it has to be something that has a really intuitive UI UX, because you're going to have to bring along all of the stakeholders and wider organization that may not have a high opinion of procurement. So if you're going to push them into using technology, it's I would almost say usability is more important than features, because you'd rather have 80-90% of your people using it, even if it doesn't do anything, than having a bells and whistles platform that only 10-20% of people use because it's clunky and it's complicated.
Yeah, well, at the end of the day, it's about it's that usability. It's and I forget the word, but it's adoption. So it's and you've seen companies, the valuation of Procuretech companies is often down to adoption as opposed to functionality and features and benefits. So you'll have tools that have perhaps got less function and features in the past that have actually had higher valuations than others because they've just had that adoption, that stickiness, and so the recurring revenue continues, as opposed to you implement something and you think, what, my team can't use it, and it's harder to keep the customers. So I do see that being a big thing, is how do we make this technology as easy and as accessible as possible, even if it might not be the most powerful. That's definitely something to consider, as part of where we're going to go, what technology we're going to use.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Yeah.
We often go backwards and forwards between suites and best of breed. And as some of the more those providers that you would consider as being the suite providers, they're starting to build marketplaces where it's basically apps that will then connect into their more broader reaching software. Do you see that as being the future? Is it going to be, we're going to have these 3 or 4 platforms of which all apps then go into, or there's still a world where a procurement organization is going to look and piece together their own technology map based on these smaller best of breed solutions?
Yeah, I have an opinion on this, and it's a little bit controversial. I did a LinkedIn post on this a few weeks ago, and I got the mixed responses from it. So I would look towards the B2C space, and if you look at what Google and Apple have done in how they've built the moat around access to apps through their mobile phone operating system, it's a very captive market, and it's a cash cow for them, right? Apple I think takes 30%. I'm sure if someone's on this and can correct me if I'm wrong. I think Apple takes 30% of the revenue from any app that's sold in Apple's App Store. Now, I think it's a very parasitic business model, but I think it's a very successful one. Mm-hmm. So if you look at some of these legacy players, even if you talk to people that work there, they will admit that their technology is not cutting edge and that their usability is not 1A. So what do they have going for them? Well, they have brand equity, and they have that they were the first movers back in, going back to Reba, they had something in the late 90s, didn't they, or early 2000s? Mm-hmm. So they have market share, they have brand equity, they have a lot of incumbent users, and they have a lot of senior relationships, and they have the ear of a lot of senior people within the organizations. Now, are these big organizations that already have these types of software in situ, is the CPO or the CFO likely to put their hand up and say, yeah, we spent $1 million on some software and it's not very good, so let's rip it out?
Yeah,
probably not. So what are they going to then do to make that software more usable? And I think putting those app stores in place, and Salesforce has been really successful as well. if we're going to look at a B2B example, they've been really, really successful at bringing in marketplaces. So the answer to your question, do I see that as being the future where two or three big players control the market? I sincerely hope it isn't, because I think it will stifle a lot of innovation. But I suspect it might be for certainly the enterprise market. I think for greenfield digital transformation projects in rapidly scaling tech companies and mid-market, I don't think that will be the future, because why would they go out and buy one of these legacy players other than a good salesperson? But for the enterprise market, I fear it may go that way. I would love to be proven wrong, but I fear it could go that way. But with that being said, I am really, really excited about what's out there in this intake to procure and process orchestration place. I've been speaking to a few of these providers over the past couple of weeks. We're putting together a bit of a white paper on this as a topic. And I was curious, what's the difference between all of them? I genuinely didn't know. And it is a really innovative space, and there is, big, deep blue ocean there to be able to go and sweep up some market share from some of these big legacy suite providers. I would also say that some of the newer players that are coming onto the market in the suite space that have built more of a Lego-based structure where you can go out and buy a sourcing module and accounts payable module, and then later on you can buy a contracts module or a P2P module. I think that's a really innovative approach, and I think they will also be able to capture some of the market and be able to snap at the heels of some of the big legacy players as well. But I guess then that will kind of depend on how successful are these players in building out their marketplace infrastructure and leveraging that.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you about which area of Procuretech you're most excited about, and you talked about intake and process orchestration, and I certainly feel that as well. I feel it's more than a marketing hype of a new category. It's something that really will enable, one, there's the user experience. Two, there's being able to bring consistency of process, but around guidelines and frameworks. It brings a lot of transparency to what's happening in terms of the points within the business that are involved in a transaction. But then there's the whole, connecting all the different tools that may not natively connect, like a Zapier that we would use behind the scenes at procurement, but for all your procurement technology stack. And then that just allows you to do so much more with all those pieces of technology that you could necessarily do on their own, because there's still all these handoff, I guess, between all the different tools and tech, where you just kind of eradicate that when you're using process orchestration. So I'm really interested to see where that goes.
Yeah, intake and process orchestration is one. And I think this is going to be a bit of a boring answer, because I know the sexy answer is something like automated negotiation. And yes, that is exciting, but it's only going to be like the massive corporations that can really afford and leverage that. But I think if we look at it more mundanely, there is so much opportunity, and this is even accessible to pretty small businesses. If you look at more, you mentioned Zapier, if you look at more generic apps that can help with automation, if you look at even just something as simple as Airtable or a similar type of app that could be used to automate the vendor onboarding process, or that could be used to automate sending a PO out to a supplier, or doing some sort of invoice match. There's a lot of opportunity there, and even like build a bot type of companies that if you want to have a bespoke automation, and you can, I know one of the person, I know the founder personally, they can go out and build a bot for just €3,000 or €4,000, which is, even a $5-10 million business is going to be able to go out and afford that if they just want to do some simple PR to PO or accounts payable automation. I think that, if you take a step back, the average procurement team is still bogged down with, my invoice hasn't been paid, or my payment terms are wrong, or I didn't get this email, or I didn't get this change of delivery date. Just got to get the basics right.
I know. That's why it kind of goes back to the question earlier about where you focus first. And while the we may immediately go to the upstream, like how do we do the fun things like really interesting category strategy, and driving new marketplaces and bringing innovation. We have to, what's going to get the biggest bang for the buck in terms of perception of procurement is making sure that suppliers are paid on time. And it's the stuff that it's the downstream things that, sometimes we just take for granted, or we think that it's their nuisance more than anything. But that drives 90% of the perception of procurement, is how much difficulty stakeholders have when they're buying stuff and how much difficulty their suppliers have in transacting with us.
Yeah, and just things like getting Incoterms right in your master data so that you're not being ripped off on freight.
Yeah, and having all the master data in one place so they can go and update it in one go, rather than figuring out who do they send things to and where do I send invoices, and it goes into a black hole. Which is relatively basics, but I think still a lot of folks are struggling with.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, I love looking at all the sexy stuff that's out there, and it's always good fun going to conferences like DPW and seeing all of the cutting edge solutions, but get beyond Fortune 500 companies and most procurement teams haven't got the basics right. And I genuinely think that's, in terms of increasing our stature in front of stakeholders, like you said, the biggest bugbear with stakeholders and suppliers is my invoice hasn't been paid, or the payment centers. Let's get this right first, and then we can look at automated negotiations and bots and everything like that.
Now, one of the areas that you intimated a little bit when you talked about using an Airtable, for example, as a database that you can build some kind of form on top of. Do you see, especially when I'm thinking about the high growth tech firms that they've already invested in some kind of ticketing system, or some no code platform that is not a procurement technology per se, but do you see teams looking, saying, rather than making an investment in pure Procuretech, let's try and use something that already exists today and build something on top of it, natively, or by using, just connecting different no-code platforms to it?
I certainly think there's potential to do that. And I think the challenge to any of these procurement tech companies that have built something that's specifically focused on procurement that is a no-code platform is, can you price it and market it well enough, competitively enough, to be able to put forward a convincing argument that you need that particular piece of tech, rather than just, as you say, going with a more generic no-code application. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer, but it's a valid challenge to say, well, why would you why would you go out and buy a separate no-code piece of procurement tech?
Mm-hmm. As we're coming up on time, I think we've just got a minute or so left. Is there, as you're thinking, if somebody's watching this and they're not really sure where to start, like how do you start to think about what's the one thing? We talked about all the different options you can start, but any advice that you would give in terms of just starting to learn and understand the market?
Yeah, I mean, other than plugging my own business, which I'm not going to do, I mean, I think the biggest thing aside from searching for software is find your why, as Simon Sinek says. Too many people think about the what or the how, or they look at some interview that a CPO of a Fortune 500 company's done in a magazine and think, oh, that must be good for us then. No, just because the CPO of a Fortune 500 company has gone out and bought a certain piece of tech, if you're a $300 million business, then for the love of God, don't follow what they've done, because you're comparing apples with bananas. So look and talk to your business partners and look at what you've got around you. Look at the capabilities of the team that you've got and think, what technology, what type of technology, what problem do I most need to fix? And the example that I always give is, if 80% of your spend is on raw materials, then you probably don't need a detailed contract lifecycle management solution, because most of it is done on a PO and you've got your terms somewhere separately. If you're a professional services firm, then almost certainly do need something like that, but you certainly don't need a supply chain traceability piece of tech. So look and really consider what's the biggest fundamental problem. Is it compliance? Is it that your team is spending half of their day on admin? Is it that your suppliers are scratching around figuring out where their invoice is in the system? What is it that's taking the most time or that's costing you the most money? And only then should you then sort of get into the sort of stuff that we do, which is, helping you then to go from the top of funnel X number of suppliers that are out there that could do that, to filter down to okay, who are the 3 or 4 that we should speak to based on our individual wants and needs.
Well, James, I know it's about time to wrap up, so I want to thank you so much for joining us and sharing some of your insights, the expertise, your experience, and some of the data that you're collecting as well at ProcurementSoftware.site with our community. I want to thank everybody as well for joining us today and for switching over from our platform that we started the event in when we had the tech problems and coming over here to LinkedIn. What we're going to do is we're going to upload the videos from the sessions that we have recorded on LinkedIn back into the platform, so anybody who has that login can watch the entire event again. We'll also re-record the session that we lost in the middle by doing the switchover, so that will all be available to watch again on demand within the platform from the link that you originally got and you started watching today's event in. So James, one last time, thank you so much.
Thank you. Great to be here. Appreciate it.
Thank you. And I want to thank everyone for joining us as well. And I also would like to just thank Lavnier AI and Airbase for being our partners and sponsors with the event today, because without those, we wouldn't be able to invest all the time that we do in creating content like this. So one last time, thank you and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care, everybody.